thanks. This is going on my permanent record. Right. I'll say that my favorite mixed metaphor came from former U.S. President Warren G. Harding, who once kind of semi-infamously said, "Let's be sure not to drop anchor until we're certain we're out of the woods." For my Navy friend over here. And so today, kind of mixing metaphors in Warren G. Harding style, I hope you save some room for the kind of main course, or at least maybe the kind of delightful dessert to kind of fill up the remaining section of the afternoon. And while you're thinking about food, I'm going to tell you that when Dale asked me if I would help moderate this closing session, I thought, yeah, I've had experience herding cats, right? So I'm not sure how cats and desserts are going to go together. But in this case, we've got feral cats, domestic cats, wild game cats, and people who bring a tremendous amount of experience to bear on the range of topics that we've been talking about today. And so I'm going to just kind of kick things off by turning online to Beth Havinga, who's joining us from Berlin. Beth is the managing director for the EdSAFE AI Alliance. We'll give Beth the first opportunity to speak. I think John has volunteered to go last, and maybe we'll just go Jeremy and then Michelle and wrap up with John this afternoon. But we're really kind of wanting to get their insights as kind of insiders in all of this work to think about the power, the potential of safe AI in education, insights, lessons learned, challenges noted, things, and maybe some insights into things that they're currently thinking about and working on. But Beth, are you there online with us?
Indeed.
Okay, then why don't we turn to you?
I'm not entirely sure how I should take the reference to feral cats and in conjunction with me, but thank you. And thank you for the introduction. So it's really a pleasure to join you this evening from my side of the world at the moment. And I think I actually wanted to jump in with a comment to the last session and then segue into the EdSAFE AI Alliance. I think a couple of years ago, I did some in-depth research into what the leading successes were for interoperability predominantly in the K-12 environment globally. So I looked at all of the instances of implementation of it and who was succeeding, who wasn't. So it's interesting to hear the back then SIF implementation with Australia being referenced. I think the reason why that had such a success, and not only this instance in Australia, but other countries as well, isn't just the government buy-in, but it was actually the method of bringing the stakeholders together, which I think is often missing from some of the discussions. So what they did best was ensure that there was a representative from every single level of the education ecosystem being brought together to be able to have these discussions about what was important. The other thing I think they did really well was limit those discussions to the lowest common denominator. They realized they were never going to agree on all points. They couldn't gather the data for all points. So they agreed to disagree on a number of things, table those discussions, and then found a subset of topics they could agree upon and moved on those in terms of the interoperability frameworks. So I think there's a lot to be learned there in terms of bringing everyone together. And as a lovely segue, that's what we found was missing as well globally when we were looking at the AI ecosystem, specifically within education. So sort of looking at what's happening globally at the moment in terms of some of the uncertainties, the teacher shortages, the issues we're facing with providing access and equitable access, in terms of hybrid learning situations, in terms of some of the social disruptions that we're seeing. We found that there was going to be a need for newer technological solutions, some things that were already being used in schools, but other things which are starting to become available and made available through technologies like AI, and then have those support the learning journeys in ways that potentially school systems and structures aren't going to be able to accommodate to the same level as they have been up to now. So our idea was to really bring together this single global network of initiatives, because there is so much happening in this space. And a lot of times things are repeating themselves as well. So perspectives that I'm seeing over here, I'm seeing then repeated in other countries. And rather than having to sort of repeat the work that we're all doing, our idea was to try and bundle all of our energies and the amazing innovations that we're seeing, bring them together so that we can provide thought leadership, provide access and networking across these topics, with the bigger goal of ensuring that we're providing equitable and trusted access to education. And I think that was another key word I heard. I was listening in earlier today, was having trust. It's also something I just jumped off another call today with sort of a global report. And that was also one of the key issues that they're seeing as a major hurdle within education, is that idea of trust. And so the Alliance is really bringing together all of the existing networks and frameworks, the education organizations, research and standards bodies, to provide that global leadership and really strengthen that idea of trust through developing different benchmarks and frameworks and standards. And I think the Alliance itself has been extremely active. We've been working together across multiple different working groups and developing different frameworks, which is starting to become really exciting as we look not only at topics like bias and things like that, but really more deeper into sort of the culture that we have within education of mistakes and learning from mistakes, being able to really work on the ideas of transparency, and with a key guiding principle then of safety. So it's an exciting organization to be working with, especially with some of the minds that we're about to hear from now, and then also within the room with you there. But I think there's an absolute need to enable these technologies, because we will need to be using them. And in order to ensure that we can use them properly, we need to also understand both the challenges and some of the issues of safety, and how we can mitigate those challenges, and how we can also then bring everything together to increase that trust, ensure that we are working within a transparent and understood environment, and help increase that understanding by producing information that is really at the level necessary across all the stakeholders within the ecosystem. So for that, I think I'm happy to hand over to whoever gets to jump in next.
Thanks, Beth. And Jeremy Roschelle from Digital Promise. It's been delightful to work with EdSAFE. And I think there's really a bright future there.
Is that loud enough? Loud enough for everyone here?
I can't tell from where I'm sitting. Cool. I've worked for Digital Promise about 5 years now. It's been delightful. One of the things that's really great about it, Digital Promise is a national nonprofit that aggregates school districts that want to work together on innovation. And so we have about 150 school districts in the League of Innovative Schools. And for me, as a researcher, that's where I come from, an exciting thing has been going from crafting a research question and then going to find the schools that would help us do the study, to really listening to the schools first, and then thinking about how we could do research that supports them. And really listening to district leaders as well, because I was always frustrated in the past. I would do this great piece of research and make a big change in a school or a set of schools, and then you go back 2 or 3 years later and it was gone. Well, why was that? We never talked to the school leader. They were just out of our picture. We were interacting with individual teachers, and nothing lasts if you don't get the leaders involved. So anyway, it's been great to be at Digital Promise. Figure we're getting close to the end of the day, so I ought to say something provocative to keep everyone awake. So here's what I got to say. Mostly I work with research communities, and I think we've got amazing researchers on this planet in the field of education, really amazing set of talent. But in most cases, they're asking the wrong question with the wrong technology and the wrong data. And so what do I mean by that? Well, we're still a lot in a mode with regard to wrong question of researchers who are trying to invent the next product or the next application they want to see inserted in school. But we have Carl, for example, from Learn Platform earlier today, just documenting just how many technologies are already in use. And do schools need number 1,032? Or do they want to learn to use the 1,000 they've already purchased? Well, it's mostly they're asking the wrong question. They're still trying to insert something. They're mostly using the wrong technology. They're using very niche technologies that are maybe 10 years out or something and probably will never appear. And that might have made sense like 20 years ago when very little technology is being used. But now we're swimming in technology in schools, And there's so much to study about how to use that technology well. Like, why aren't we studying that? Why aren't we taking all these brains, these research brains that are so wonderful, and applying them to what's actually being used? And the wrong data, you know, we still live in a universe where the most common research proposal, like I do peer review, you see peer proposals all the time, it's hand-collected data. Researchers are going to go out and they're going to spend a year defining their instruments, a year or two collecting data, a year or two analyzing it, and then they'll tell you what they found, not taking advantage of all the data that's available on platforms today. So when I look at the lens of this privacy stuff, it's through the lens of what do I want to accomplish, which is I want to see the research community transform so that it's asking questions that are relevant to schools today. Like, how do I use this stuff well? How do I use it equitably? How do I pick among the 1,000 things I've got? Which are the 1, 2, or 3 to really get behind as a district leader? And what would it take to get behind it equitably, given that my district has all this diversity going on within it? You know, I'd like to really see them doing research on platforms that are out there and that have millions of kids using them every day, maybe not having such a great experience, but it could be improved. And then I'd like to see, like, how can we take advantage of the massive amounts of data? And a brief word about data. The data I care most about as a learning scientist is learning process data. I think the massive data we've had in education is mostly assessment data. And it's pretty late in the process, and it's kind of hard to read those tea leaves and figure out what went wrong. But what tech gives us, digital learning gives us, is moment-to-moment progress. And that's where we can actually learn something that's going to change the world. So, and I do want to say, like, I think that all this stuff is, I can come from a day like today and feel like, ooh, this stuff's really hard. There's so many dimensions, there's so much trust to build, so many different communities, and you have to get involved. And it is hard, but there are ways to make some progress. With Mark Schneider, who was here earlier, I have one program called SeerNet, where IES has funded 5 different large digital platforms to open up their data so that third-party researchers can pose and answer questions within these platforms that are already in use in schools, both higher ed and K-12. And so, you know, it's one small step. And then once you get into that, you realize how the privacy issues advance or limit the impact of a program like that. Some of the platforms are very reluctant to capture or share information about individual kids because it subjects them to risk as they would share that data with a third party. So they want to give data about generic kids who have no attributes. Well, we can't really solve equity problems if we don't have that. And so I see privacy in the context of that shift. We want people to shift to platforms, to stuff that's in use, to questions that matter to districts. But to do that, we have to have the privacy. Otherwise, when they get there, the data is going to be so de-identified and so anonymized that they can't answer the questions of interest. So that's why we need the investment in this to figure out this privacy stuff. Okay, I'll stop there.
Thanks, Jeremy. So I'm Michelle Barrett, and it sounds like Jim already introduced me this morning just a little bit. So I work for Edmentum. Edmentum is an organization that provides digital curriculum assessments and virtual instructors and instruction to about 5 million students domestically. We have a little international footprint as well, but primarily domestically. And I head up our research and learning engineering department. So I am responsible for all things about how we measure outcomes and all things about how we measure the impact of our interventions on those outcomes. I come by way of many years, a long trajectory, but as Jim mentioned, started my very early career as an engineer, shifted, became a middle school math and high school math teacher, and then ended up at the Colorado Department of Education for a stint, McGraw-Hill, and kind of into a progression of working on a variety of technologies for learning and assessment. At Edmentum, we process about 1 billion data points a week of student learning information. So this is a huge amount of information that we have coming into our platform, and privacy preserving techniques are actually very top of mind to make sure that we are treating that data with the respect that it deserves and with the respect that our educators and our students deserve. So the perspective that I kind of come to the table with has kind of three main areas. And the first, and I think most people in this room agree from what I've been able to take in the temperature of the room, is that there's tremendous opportunity for us to leverage newer technologies such as machine learning to solve problems in education. And I would even argue that some of these have nothing to do with personally identifiable data. So I don't want to leave those out of the mix. So we're talking about things like aligning content to standards, state standards. I'm talking about content creation. How can we write better reading passages for students using AI technologies and such? And I don't want to leave those out of the equation because I think they're really important pieces of our ecosystem that will help us to create more affordable educational opportunities for students, maybe more accessible, more available types of content for students. Then we start kind of merging a little bit into some AI technologies that for which you can train an engine, for example, without personally identifiable information. These are like what Mark was speaking to earlier this morning. Voice recognition for understanding the progress of a student in early literacy. You don't necessarily need to know that student in order for for the engine to work. Automated scoring of responses, that's actually been going on for quite a long time at this point in time of written responses. So those are areas where you can strip out the PII, right? And you can still create an AI technology that is going to be reasonably successful with doing what it needs to do. Then we kind of get over to the other end of the spectrum, and here we're talking about predictive analytics, prescriptive analytics, recommendation engines. And here is where that contextual piece really starts to kind of weigh on us and make us think really differently about privacy preserving techniques. And I'll readily admit at Edmentum, we actually use the most transparent and explainable algorithms possible because our teachers demand it. We work for educators and they need to understand why a system is telling them to do something. So we use very explainable, transparent, which those of you who work in machine learning will know that typically those aren't going to be your most fancy ML algorithms, right? But we need to be able to help our teachers understand what is working. There is a lot of promise there, though. My research team has done some work in deep knowledge tracing, and we can do better with understanding students' probability of success at certain activities when we start employing some of these methods. So that kind of takes me to point two. So point one, lots of opportunity. We should not stop this train from researching methods that may be helpful for solving problems. Part two is that we have to really consider and talk about the risks associated with it. And that's one of the reasons I think the EdSAFE AI Alliance is really important to this ecosystem. And where I worry the most about risk in the work that we do is that it's really difficult for us to evaluate the bias in our algorithms if we don't have all of the right kinds of data in order to look at that. And here's where this intersection of privacy preserving technology and AI becomes this intersection that is really important for us to take a look at. We're really interested in understanding what works. And we're really interested in understanding what works and for whom, right? So kind of taking that from the what works clearinghouse. In order for us to understand the whom part of it, we have to know something about those students. And that's where this intersection happens. So I will say that I would also love to see people conducting research that helps us work with data that isn't PII. For example, I saw in the paper on the privacy preserving technologies a mention of differential item functioning. Great technique, helps us to understand if an item is behaving differently for different subgroups of students. We recently at Edmentum conducted differential item functioning, but rather than using individual level student information, we use school level characteristics. So are there places, and I will say that method, I still would love to see advanced considerably in order for us to make sure that we're detecting bias as much as we should in those methods. So I'd love to kind of see us take this two-pronged approach to the risk. One is, how do we help make that data more available? But then also, how do we shift and change our methodologies in ways that help us to work with data that might be at levels that don't require individual student data? Hearing from my colleagues and friends who deal with issues of kind of intersectionality, I also know that sometimes you can't know something about a person without understanding the very unique pattern of traits that kind of come together to create the experience that that person has. And so there may be ways in which we can never use that aggregate level information to get there. And then finally, within risk, I worry a lot about us not having the right people at the table when we're developing our AI technologies. Just looking at this room, I can say, you know, there's probably 2 men for every 1 woman in this room today. I noticed that, and that's not a ding on anybody, it just is what it is, right? I noticed that when we go to try to recruit learning engineers for Edmentum, our applicant pools are not as diverse as we would love them to be. I notice when we come together in these organizations, we aren't necessarily inviting the commentary or the hopes of purposefully diverse groups of people. So I would love to see us also think not just about what are we doing today, but how do we build the people of tomorrow who are going to create these technologies, maintain these technologies, use these technologies in ways that are really helpful. And then I think the last comment that I'd like to make, the third, is about the human piece of it, right? So at the end of the day, we build learning technologies, or at Edmentum, we build learning technologies to serve humans. We serve teachers, we serve students, we serve parents. So behind every one of our data points is a real life kid who maybe didn't have breakfast that morning, who maybe is struggling with dyslexia. I've got one of my own kids with that. We have real live people behind the scenes of all of this. And if we forget that what we're trying to do is solve problems, we're not trying to create solutions in search of a problem. We're trying to solve problems and creating solutions that meet those problems. I think that we'll do a lot better. What we've learned at Edmentum is that rarely a quantitative analysis is going to give us everything that we need. So while we have a lot of data and we can work with that data, we monitor dashboards on learning outcomes, on learner engagement on a daily basis. We also conduct a lot of qualitative research. Mixed methods are incredible tools for helping us understand the context. So as you're looking at what does it take for us to do this well, we can't forget that qualitative piece of how do we get people in the field? How do we ask the question why? I have 3 teenage daughters. And one of the things that I have learned is that you always ask why, because they make really strange decisions multiple times, right? They make really different decisions than those that I might be expecting, and that happens all the time in my line of work. If I am not surprised on a daily basis, I feel like something's going wrong, right? You have to ask why. So I think that that's what I would like to leave it with, is that we love data. I love data. We love data. We love working with the data in order to make things better for students. And at the end of the day, we have to remember that they are humans at the other end of our work. All right.
So my name is John Medin, and much like Michelle, I run the same type of group for Renaissance Learning. And I guess the most unique part of me is I don't have the background in education. I spent 28 years in predictive analytics of courts and judges, and then moved on to working with global trade and tax and accounting and eventually news. And what we did through that whole process is we got very good at being able to tell what a judge was going to do. Judges all want to think that they're very unique, but if you take a a look at enough data points, you start becoming pretty clear. And some of those data points are pretty unique, like how long does a judge take to rule on a motion 56, rule for summary judgment? You can get data for how long they take to make that ruling that starts bringing signal into what their long-term decision is going to be. And at a point of doing that, my current boss, we met at a wedding. We'd met way back in college. He said, I want to start taking a better look at students and how the individual student is doing. So that's what a bit of my team does. Most of my team is spending keep the lights on work about how are we norming students, how are they looking across, how is the school doing generally. But with a wife that's a special education teacher, that is not my passion. My passion was, okay, you're building a curve and there's kids at the tail, and those kids at the tail can be way off the normal models. And my passion is going to be, what are we going to do in education to identify those children, and what identifying is not as hard as what's going to help. And when it comes to that, I think the world's open. We're getting to the place where we have enough data to take a look at how a child's doing in real time. One of the last schools I was at, the head of an assessment came and said, John, what I really care about is my response to intervention, and did it work? And I want to know the day after I finished, right? And if you just take a look at assessments, you're not going to get that. You know, you might be, for a max for us, a child might be doing assessment 23 times a year, right? That's a lot of breaks in between. But what my team has started to do is take a look at how do we take the practice data that we have in the instructional data and start mixing the data points to give us real-time feedback of how the child's doing. And what we found is we can be relatively accurate. We can be more accurate than our old modeling. But that starts bringing up a lot of privacy issues. And so when I joined EdSAFE, and I thank Dale and Jim and Jeremy, and meeting more recently Michelle, comes on very high recommendations, just so you all know, from my best friends of the best boss ever. But what I really am starting to appreciate and like about all these voices is, what are we going to do to push the boundaries? And I'm going to be a little bit provocative, push the boundaries on data privacy, not violating children's rights, but it's very easy to sit behind and be afraid. And when people are afraid, they do nothing. And so my response is, give me the standards and give me the protection, and I want to share data. Matter of fact, I'd love to have a pool of data that PhD candidates can come in, because I don't know what your staff is like, but I don't have enough staff to be doing all the extracurricular studies that could be done as to what is the data telling us. So we're in very exciting times right now. We have the data, but now we need the framework around how do we go after it, how do we study it, how do we protect children, but at the same time, not get so hung up about the world of opposition that we're kind of seeing and realizing. I have a director of metadata and product interoperability. That's not interoperability with Michelle's products. That's how do I get my products, right, to be interoperable. So we haven't even started to solve the rest. And then you have rostering issues. So, as some of the bigger companies have gone, and we're buying other companies, which is good to supplement data and get a better picture of the child. But now if I'm starting to take, how do I know Jimmy, or what I would rename as entity 1, and then someone else's entity 2, how do I know that they're the same child or not the same child? Because you have to have that trueness to the data to be able to build any kind of insights off of it. So anyway, that's kind of currently where we sit as a company. We're ready to share data. We need data protection. And there's a number of people I've mentioned, is states are popping up every other week with legislation. And some of those states conflict. One will tell you have to do something in one color, and another will say it has to be in a different color. how does, a company wants to have the input of all the kids from 50 states, but how can you do that if you're told you have to do two different things and still make it economical to meet those standards? So anyway, the hopeful part, I'll just say, when my team breaks it back down, and we just do what's in front of us. And so what do things like that mean? Well, I'm concerned about security and bias. So with my concern about bias, we reached out, I'm not sure if any of you watched Coded Bias. We reached out to Joy and we said, hey, Joy, would you come and allow the movie to be played for all of our engineering staff and all of our product developers? And she said, sure. So we brought it in, and then we had a follow-up. We had the producer, and she came in for an hour straight of answering all the questions. And this is getting at the fact that most people aren't intentionally gonna violate privacy, or they're not gonna violate intentionally bias. But you start seeing how easy it is to run afoul. And of course, the only way that you can test those things is collect data that some jurisdictions tell me, hey, we're not gonna send you ethnic background. Well, then how can I tell you that my product's efficacious to your students, right? So we just need common sense as we go out, and when I get back to protection, I mean, we're talking about the different states and all the legislation. I think we really need to be a voice, and there needs to be one standard for research and another standard for a released product. And what does that mean? We're not dumping all, regulation on the research side. But we also can't scare the heck out of companies that trying to do this, I'm doing it on the edge. I'm doing it with, workers that are very interested, and they're doing it on their extra time. That's not a part of the keep the lights on work. So we're doing things like that. We created an AI code of ethics at the company. All the team has to go through that. We have outside innovation speakers come in constantly to talk about new technologies. And so blockchain was one of them. And that was such a, everything was very interesting at the time. And the one that came in to speak about it, he was an executive vice president for MasterCard. He said, just think about the immutability, and is that always good? Is it the right decision? So for instance, you go to Singapore and you chew a piece of gum and you get kicked out of the country. Now try to go to another country and you have a status on you that says you've been kicked out of a country.
Yeah.
Right? So that's not saying that it's all bad, but we have to think through those things. So we bring in outside speakers to deal with that. We bring in legal training. I work very close with our privacy officer, and we created a council called the Innovation by Design. Now all new products that are released have to go through a bias evaluation, a security violation, or evaluation, privacy, UX, and architecture to make sure that we're designing in safe methods. And then you were talking about, what does the audience look like? Well, we have internships now for high school students, and we target specifically students that aren't in or wouldn't normally be seen in the groups. And we found that that's become one of our pools for bringing in future workers. We take it at high school, we start, and then we continue on to postgraduate and college. And so these are just little things, I know, but if we all do those little things that are in front of us while also addressing these concerns, I think we'll move the needle.
Well, so I'll give you a moment to think about your question or questions that you might have for the panel. I will say this is a pretty rare opportunity to have three, I know you're all too modest or humble to accept this, but I'll ask you not to push back on me too hard, but it's very rare to have three people as brilliant and insightful as this on a panel together. As a former dean, it makes me wish that I was back on a campus and I had the three of you in the classroom together or living in a dorm together, because I'd love to see what you come up with at 2 o'clock in the morning and trying to think about, how would the world look if we were able to write the rules, right? Able to create the structure or the environment that we might need in order to push something ahead. In reference to Michelle commenting about the unique thought processes of teenagers, right? I will say that one of my former colleagues, Abby Barrett, who's now a psychology professor at Vassar, did research on adolescent decision-making. And one of the things that she shared with my staff at the college where we were working together was a video, kind of a surveillance video, basically, of a discussion. And the question that she asked students individually and then in a group setting was, swimming with sharks, good idea or bad idea? And reliably, when students were being talked to one-on-one, bad idea, bad idea. As soon as they were sitting around a table together and it was mixed groups, there were boy groups, there were all girl groups, the first thing you notice was, the sound, Abby had the sound turned off. The first thing you notice was all of the eyeball checking around the room. And the first person to speak would usually say, it depends. And it gives you a sense of like the different importance or value of the social environment on decision-making, how important peer recognition or peer kind of feedback might be for people who are kind of figuring out life, right, and going through, and they do make big consequential decisions. I think sometimes as people, actors kind of within a field, we can do the same thing. And I would go back to a comment that Jeremy made that, or to paraphrase it, we could choose to avoid the risk and avoid the discomfort of trying to sort this out, or we can lean in and figure out how we're going to manage the risk, how we're going to frame it. And I think, heard that in Michelle and John's comments as well. So I want to have, having bought you a minute or two, kind of turn to you all to see what questions you have or what ideas or suggestions you might have. And if we need to, Beth, we may come to you because I think we spoke a few weeks back about whether the industry sector or the field was ready for something that in the medical field would be like the morbidity and mortality conferences, where there's a confidential setting where you can unpack what happened and what didn't work, right? And I think that there are some things around how we approach risk, how we create a safe harbor for conversations, or sharing information that could have a broader value outside of our own silos that we're going to have to lean into at some point. But let me first turn to the audience here and audience online to see what questions you might have.
Thanks. Jim, just hearing you say that, when I was thinking about I wonder what my peers think about this and that kind of group dynamic of decision making, I'm less concerned about these guys and more concerned about the state chief data officers or the superintendents, and they might not be making their decisions from a place of even knowledge or deep knowledge. So is it their job to help inform them about what is possible? And how does that not just come across as, I have something wonderful to sell you?
Yeah. Great. Any reactions or responses?
Is that a question or a statement? Well, I would just say that it's very hard to do that and not make it look very self-interested. And so that's why I would take a look to Dale and team to say this is what EdSAFE can really be a part of helping us do, is get that message out. I think I asked during your presentation, how do you get trust? It's like, well, it's got to be open. It's got to be very clear what you're doing. And but that's hard. And it's hard to get it to teachers and then hard to get it, to the parents beyond that.
I think if I may as well jump in, and that's one of the things that we decided was the most important when we were first starting to think about what we could even do in this environment. The fact that a lot of the decisions that are being made at the moment are either being made out of fear or a lack of knowledge, and at a global level. So one of our first outputs as a group was to start thinking about how we could help these conversations and dialogues progress and gain access to the knowledge so that they felt really empowered in the decisions that they were making. And this covers every decision-making group from the students, the teachers, and the parents up through to some of the parliamentary organizations that we're supporting to really help sort of unpack some of those extremely complex issues, and then also make some of the ones that at the moment seem to be sort of like a black box become more transparent and easily accessible.
Yeah, I turned it. Maybe to follow on, I'm not familiar with Edmentum's policies, but I do know that Renaissance Learning is a leader in our space in interoperability and sharing data. So you said it. Sometimes I hear people say it and they don't back it up with words, and you all do. Now, my question is for the people who are in the companies, and especially I know there's lots of other companies, what are the incentives that we can put in place so that more people act like Renaissance and possibly others, I don't know, and not more like other companies that I see that are very much trying to hold on?
I would say that it's not necessarily holding on because of like worry of you're going to get my secret sauce. I would kind of like dispel that that's why. And I would say that it's much more about the risk calculation. And so I would say that, you know, as a community, the better we can create the types of agreements that our state, you know, CIOs feel good about, that our district folks feel really good about, the better off we'll be, the more streamlined and easy we can make it. I think, I'm trying to remember who said this morning about the, I don't have the staff. Like, so you come to me, you ask a question, you need some data, I got to put a week's time of my staff member on this. So the better that we can get to a place of data sharing without the lift of the manual, and maybe some of your solutions there that you were presenting earlier can help with that. I think that those are ways to make it easier for organizations. But at the end of the day, I think that people are coming from a very good place of wanting to serve the students and the educators that they serve really well. And so I think that it's about making sure that the right protections are in place for those individuals, that I think would unlock the door at more companies than what is currently going on. I really don't think it's about secret sauce. I know that wouldn't be a motivator for us at Edmentum.
When it comes to secret sauce, I've evaluated a lot of different industries for patent portfolios. Ed tech's not one of them that leads the way in that space. So
yeah, and as you were saying too, John, like that we don't have enough researchers in-house, you know, by any stretch of the imagination to do as much as we could potentially do with the information that we have from learners.
the way I'm currently building out my in-house staff of researchers is to use NLP processing to make our content people more efficient, and then repurposing their time to work on the project. So that's kind of what it looks like for me. When I came in, the group's flat. We have to work on the innovation, but we have to keep the lights on. And it's a great advantage if we can start getting a whole nother pool of people with fresh ideas that can get in and take a look at the data. And companies want to protect themselves if it's the secret sauce. Thomson Reuters had labs for financial markets, right? And people could get in the building. They had key access to certain areas, certain amount of data. And all TR got out of it was first options to buy if the person decided to sell what they discovered. So I think there's ways to protect that, but still allow lots of research to happen. That just isn't happening. I just think we've gone way too long of not addressing the tails of the curve where the students are struggling. If we were to really make a difference, that's the greatest area of difference. If you can change a child's view of how successful they are, you've changed that child for their entire rest of their life. Right? When it comes to security and thinking, okay, what's security for a child? Security is all of the parts of their life that come after that part. Can they do the things that they want to do? Can they get into the schools that they want to do? A lot of that starts with what they think about themselves. So as we can get better at addressing those tails, we'll change lives. And again, that's kind of where I really love research and extra help doing that. And if it's the data that I have that helps, let's make sure that it's protected. Let's make sure we're protected, and give us the standards.
Okay, great. So John, while your mic is hot, we have a follow-up question to your mentioning of coded bias. And the person who kind of is online with us mentioned that there's kind of ongoing work related to third-party audits and impact assessments, right? That spills out from that. So this is a two-part question, and maybe we'll start with you, but anyone is welcome to chime in. One, how prevalent are third-party audits among ed tech companies with AI embedded in their products? And two, how open would ed tech companies be in your kind of respective perceptions to algorithmic auditing performed by others outside of your own companies?
That's a good question. Let me start with the second part, I think it was, of the question. There has to be a difference between the regulations and oversight that comes with research and what comes with a released product. I know that some of the language that I started reading of one of the Congresswoman's bills talked about you had to pre-apply for what research you were going to do and cite all of the best research that's already been done to justify your research. I hate to tell you, but I have more data, and Michelle has more data than all of the other, kind of subgroups that are out. And there's other ed tech. I'm not saying that other ed techs don't. The leading research is probably going to be made available or be able to be done by the ed tech companies that have all these products, right? So getting back there, that's one thing, right? Then when you get to the released products, that's where I see openness to making sure, because now you're actually taking what you think you've learned and releasing it on someone's education. And at that time, it has to be clear. It has to be clear before it goes out. Now, research, I don't see, well, there's nothing in place right now to force third-party research into what you're doing. But I know that there are groups that come in, and there's groups, I think it was Carl's, that we were talking about earlier, that will come in and take a look to give you kind of that stamp. I think there would be openness, but there's not a lot that I've experienced.
Yeah, I tend to be in agreement that I think that there would be openness, and certainly, that there are third-party studies that get conducted all the time on algorithms, or not necessarily on algorithms. And one of the things that I was thinking about, Jim, as you were asking this question, is that I think in order to conduct an audit of an algorithm for bias, you actually have to know what that algorithm is meant to be optimizing and for whom it's meant to be optimized. And I do feel like on the ed tech side, we're not as great about being able to explicitly say what that is. So some people, I've got this great adaptive algorithm. It does X, Y, Z. It, goes in, it does, when a student does this, then it does this. We don't say what we're trying to do is minimize the amount of time that a student spends, blah, da, 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 da. Or we don't say we're trying to optimize the amount of growth the student is going to see, which could be two very different algorithmic solutions. And so I think that while companies would be open to it, I also think that we have a long way to go in being able to define what that would look like, partly because I feel like some of these methods and technologies and models are new enough that people are still kind of trying to figure out those basic questions and ideas, and they're still designing. So, and
Yeah, and I would say from both the sort of EdSAFE and digital promise idea, we're also seeing a pretty good response to things like product certifications, where companies voluntarily say, I'm going to just self-disclose how I discover and address bias in my product. And likewise, micro-credentials for educators say, I'm going to show you how much I've learned about an issue like bias in my product and the products I might be vetting. And so I think part of our responsibility is not like just to be the educators who directly touch every person, but create a system in which the knowledge is available and you can earn credit in some way for being a good citizen of the ecosystem, and thereby catalyze lots of people to do the work, to sort of crowdsource some of what we need.
Yeah, very helpful comments, because I think, we this afternoon talked some about risk kind of more explicitly, and started off the day really thinking about the intersection around policy. And it seems like one of the things we also have to get clear on in terms of policy is whether we're setting up, this kind of evaluation for improvement or evaluation for accountability, right? How much we want to create a playing field that leaves room for innovation, kind of transparency and improvement versus taking someone to task if something doesn't measure up against some real or imagined kind of accountability standard. And I think Michelle, your comments about we're closer to the beginning than we are to the middle, I think are really quite instructive too. Right? Okay. I think in the interest of time, let me ask: are there any other questions from our participants, or Beth? Any question that, given the time that you spent with us today, questions that are rolling through your mind, either about this panel or topics today more generally? Okay, hearing none. Let me ask for the panelists, because this is a fairly rare opportunity for the three of you all to be in each other's company with a little bit of breathing room. I'm wondering if you have any ideas or questions for each other, that you have been kind of wondering about that you didn't get a chance to take care of during a break, kind of in the action earlier today.
Well, I guess I'd just ask you how optimistic you are in the short and long term that we can make some progress on the things we care about here. Like get enough privacy that we can answer the questions that we want to see answered. So, optimistic short term, long term?
Very optimistic long term.
I'm an eternal optimist. So I actually am very excited about what we can do and what we can learn. And I think kind of reflecting on comments from this morning, the educational ecosystem is extraordinarily complex. People are extraordinarily complex. I mean, nobody is like a really easy to read book for me. Maybe that's just me. I don't know, but it's really difficult work. And it is some of the most fascinating work that we can be doing. And I am also optimistic because I run into exactly 0 people who don't have the best interests of the people that they're serving in mind at this point in time. I know that there was a comment earlier this morning about bad actors. And while I believe they probably exist, I would say by and large, there are people out there who want to do really good things for our learners. What I would love to see to help stimulate some of that optimism is some better communication across the different parties that are involved in all of this work. Because I do think that it's easy for our ML engineer to forget about the teacher who's trying to use the product. I think that it's easy for the teacher to be really focused on just what they need to get done that day in the classroom and forget that there might actually be some tools out there that could be useful. So I just feel like we have a lot of fabric to weave here in order to get to be at a place where we're going to be really successful. But I am absolutely optimistic that that will happen.
I want to add to the optimism and just say that I haven't seen a topic like this move as fast through all the regulatory bodies globally as I have been seeing in the past 12 months alone. And I think there are so many people who are actively trying to find really good and practical solutions to some of the regulations to make this entire environment safe. The key thing now, and I think that's sort of circling back to where we were at the start, is to ensure that we really do have the entire ecosystem represented, that the outcomes and the effects of these regulations are thought through with all of the different stakeholders so that we can ensure that what's being implemented leaves the space required for innovation, leaves the space required as well for new directions of development you can't even comprehend now. And I think it's an exciting time. There's so much going on, and the chance now is there for us to bring it all together and really ensure that the right people are sitting at the table.
Okay, excellent. And Jeremy, that was such a good question. Would you care to answer it?
You know, we have a super complex system here, but part of that is everything's always going on all at once. And so it's also very experimental. We're not waiting for an order from top down for everyone to move in the same direction. And so I think in that, there's a lot of pairwise experiments or smaller experiments of how we can open things up. And so I'm optimistic because I think we have the opportunity to learn fast and to push this forward. The thing I'm most afraid of is the openness to trying new things shutting down because we get too scared. So I think that's why all the talk today about community and trust is so important, because that's the biggest resource we have is our willingness to try new things.
Okay,
So
terrific. Well, that's a powerful note to end this panel on. So if you would please join me in thanking Beth and our panelists here.